Well, welcome back. This time round I'm going to type the Hinged stiff link. Now, there's not many differences between the Hinged stiff link and the Chod rig. Really the only difference is there's a boom section being put between that swivel and this pop-up section. So I'm going to start off by tying up one of those boom sections. Now remember, the stiff link is called, well, it's the Hinged stiff link, but it's called that for a reason, and that's because it's stiff, you know, so you want quite a thick material. This is actually 35-pound breaking strain, so you can imagine it's quite a thick chunky line. Now it's stiff enough to allow the bait to fall away from the lead, but it's not so stiff that it'll end up poking up in the air if it falls in debris. It's still got a bit of suppleness to it, but it's ever so strong. Now you need 2 swivels for these boom sections. Now for the bottom swivel, the one that the hook's attached to, and probably the most important one, that needs to be really free running. And for that I do use the Unilink swivel in a size 10, just because they are so free running. For the other end, I prefer something a little bit bigger, a little bit more chunky, because that's going to be riding up and down the lead core. And fished as a rotary rig, you want quite a big loop on it, quite a big ring on the swivel. And for that end, I use one of these big 50-pound test swivels with a round eye. So, onto the material. And this is a simple figure of 8 knot. Once, twice. And it's always best to tighten these knots up, either with the handle of a beta needle, or I've actually made these. These are like little pieces of carbon out of an old broken rod. And that way it keeps the loops round. If you was to tighten up with that with something like the end of a bait needle, it's just going to damage that mono section. So important to use a nice wide round surface. And don't try and make these loops too small either. I see a lot of people, they try and make these loops really small, thinking that the neater, you know, the neater the better, but not necessarily so. You really do want quite a big chunky loop on these. So make sure that's dead tight. And you trim off that excess. There we go, little blob on the end of that. And you can see that's lovely. A nice loop, perfectly neat and straight, you know, it's not kicking off at an angle. How long you actually have these boom sections, it's entirely up to you. I prefer to have them probably about 7 inches. Sometimes shorter still. So you want your size 10 swivel on there, and you're going to do exactly the same thing. You're going to tie a figure of 8 loop knot. So, wet that down. And again, with the round surface of my little rig tool, you tighten that knot down. Trim that off. Little blob with a lighter. And finally, give it a nice stretch, get it nice and straight, and the loop's perfectly round at the end. And there's our boom section. Lovely. All right, I've already shown you how to tie up the actual hook section, and now I always tie up several. You know, once I'm on the bank and the rods are out, there's not a lot else to do, so always make sure I've got plenty of these tied up. So I'm going to get one of these out. Get a nice size 4 out again, because I'll probably be using one of these later. And then with that simple 2-turn blood knot that I showed you earlier, we attach the pop-up section onto there. Remember, you could have this pop up really high if you wanted, or really low. If I wanted, I could tie this honestly a centimetre long, but ideal height is probably about 1.5 inches of bristle filament. bearing in mind that the pop-up's going to be a little bit high because it's sat on top of the hook. So through the swivel, once, twice around the material, and then back through the first loop that you formed. And there's the knot slack, you can see it's ever so small. Tighten him up carefully after wetting, as always. Bed him down. It's never coming undone in a million years, but just for your own peace of mind, block that end. And then, because this is a hinged stiff link, with the chod rig, the actual weight of the lead core is used to sink the pop-up. With this, you need to actually add putty onto the swivel. So, a little bit of pop-up putty. And even this wants to be done neatly, you know, you don't just want a big blob of it chucked on there any old how. Put it on nice and neat and smooth. Like that, nice and neat. Put that curve in the pop-up section, like so. And there's a reason for using, you know, these swivels are ever so free running, and that's important, and that helps the rig work. I mean, basically, when a fish shuts its mouth, the first thing a fish does when it takes a bait is shut its mouth. That's before it moves away or anything. And a lot of rigs, they do depend on the fish moving away and tightening up to the lead before the hook actually turns around and does its job. With this one, really all it's got to do is shut its mouth on this bristle filament. And as soon as it does that, the hook will spin straight round to the bottom lip every time. Once there's a bait on there, I'll show you that a lot better. But that's why it's so important that this swivel here isn't sticky. It must be free running. And the last thing, we'll straighten that out again. And I do this all the time before I cast out, before every cast. Make sure that that's nice and straight and neat. And there is the hinge stiff link. And obviously that just goes straight on the lead core leader. I wouldn't have as much tubing, I just have a small piece, but this goes straight on the lead core leader in replace of the boom section, in replace of the actual chod rig. So it's just another variation of it, and one that's very, very successful and really shouldn't be forgotten about. Big up the hinged stiff rig.